Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody in our audience. I'm Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute, and we are joining you here from a chilly December morning in Washington, D.C., for what is an important discussion on a pivotal visit, takeaways from the visit of Mohammed bin Salman to Washington. It is very clear that the visit of Mohammed bin Salman and his very large Saudi delegation is a consequential event and potentially a turning point in the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. There was a huge focus on trade and investment during the trip, and a 1,000-person Saudi delegation composed of government officials and business leaders attended a day-long Saudi trade event that was held inside the huge Opera House at the Kennedy Center. There was serious discussion of Saudi Arabia's purchase of F-35s and other U.S. High technology weapons. There was an outline reached on civil nuclear cooperation, although the details still seem to be worked out. And to the disappointment of the Trump administration, the Saudis were clear that they were not yet ready for a normalization deal with Israel. Now, to unpack all of these topics and others, we have assembled a really good group this morning. We have Kristin Diwan, who is a senior resident scholar here at AGSI, who works on generational change, nationalism, and evolution of Islamism in the countries of the Gulf. We have Dr. Bernard Haykel, who is a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, and as well as an expert on Saudi Arabia and on Yemen. We hope soon to have Abdulrahman al-Rashed, the chairman of Arabiya's editorial board and the former general manager of the Arabiya news channel. And moderating the conversation for us is senior resident scholar at AGSI, Hussein Ibish. So Hussein, I will hand you the microphone and retreat into the background, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Silliman, and I want to welcome all of our viewers and participants around the world to the follow-up to a great conversation that we had before the MBS Washington trip with Professor Haykel, with Dr. Diwan, and at that time with also instead of Abdulrahman al-Rashed, we had can't remember. Yeah, that's right. And so, yeah, my brain sort of senior moment. Okay, so it's not just here; it's also growing in the synapses above my nose. Anyway, everything Ambassador Silliman said is correct technically, but I think I'd like to sort of disagree on one point. I don't really believe there was any agreement on nuclear energy. I think the joint declaration basically demonstrates that there's a lot of work to be done on that file. There's a great deal of Saudi investment promised for the United States, up to $1 trillion, perhaps. I find that to be unlikely, but even a fraction of that would be dramatic. And the designation of Saudi Arabia as the major non-NATO ally of the United States, plus a strategic defense agreement, none of which meets Saudi Arabia's, and we welcome Abdulrahman al-Rashed to our group. So as promised, we have one of the most important Saudi commentators and analysts of his generation. So we're really pleased to have now the full set, and that's a great thing. So I just wrapping up my own observations is that I think that this designation of alliance and the strategic defense agreement falls short of what Saudi Arabia is hoping to achieve with the United States, not necessarily from this visit, but what they were working on with President Biden before the October 7, 2023 attack on southern Israel and the subsequent Gaza war, and also, afterwards. And so it seems to me, well, I'm going to keep my own observations to a side for a second. We'll come back to that. Let me begin by asking Professor Haykel what his generalized take on this visit was. My sense is modest progress on the bilateral overall, but give me a sense of your big takeaway.
Thank you. So I wrote a piece. Unfortunately, it appeared in French, so not in English, about the visit. I think several things were accomplished. I mean, the first is the fact that Mohammed bin Salman was received at the White House in a quasi-state official visit. There was a fly a pass and horses, and then a dinner. And then a press conference in which, he said what he had to say and spoke in English. I think all of this was very good for him and for the country. Also, I think domestically, the fact that Saudi Arabia was received and he was received in such a official and very respectful fashion played very well domestically among the Saudi public. All of that is, I think, quite important. Um, and the visit was nearly canceled at the last minute because the Trump administration had put some demands on normalization that were unacceptable. So the fact that a visit happened at all is a good thing. It was good for MBS. It was good for the Saudis. I think there was a lot of symbolism, a lot of promises, and if you listen carefully to how the Crown Prince spoke. So, for instance, on investments, he was very clear that unless something directly benefits the kingdom, he's just not going to put money in anywhere. So, despite the promise of $1 trillion, it was very clear that whatever he's going to spend here has to benefit the transformation diversification project of Vision 2030. And the mutual defense agreement builds on what was already being discussed and negotiated with the Biden administration. We don't have details, but I think it goes broadly in the trajectory of what the Crown Prince wants. Ultimately, Crown Prince wants a mutual defense treaty with NATO 5 like guarantees. That's a long-term process. I don't think he's going to get it. He knows he's not going to get it now, but the first steps towards that have been now laid. All in all, I think very positive for the kingdom. Um, got more out of it than the Americans got out of this visit. And and it lays the foundation for a future relationship that's strategic and that's built on an alliance. The AI agreement, I think, actually was quite substantive, however, and because it does imply that certain technologies from China will not be brought in, certain guarantees and safeguards will be put in against transference of American technology to China. So if there's one thing that's
Yeah.
really substantive, it's the AI agreement.
I think that's a really welcome correction. I think you're right. I think that was the single biggest bilateral takeaway. That and a general tone of bonhomie. Your piece in French, where was it published?
It was published in L'Express, and I also made
Nice.
one additional point in there, which is that I think the Saudis are now overly identified with President Trump and with the Republicans, and they need to diversify their and branch out their relations with all sides of the political spectrum in the U.S., even with those who dislike them intensely. But I think that would be a smart.
Democratic left, for example.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for example.
And
But,
the Islamophobic.
many of whom are now Muslim, so they can all be invited, they can be invited to Saudi Arabia
Yeah.
for the Hajj.
Yeah. And then there's the Islamophobic right. So, yeah, absolutely. Um, And L'Express is the French publication with which you are primarily associated historically, so no surprise there. You've had they quote you a lot, and yeah. So I think that's good to know. Let's go to my colleague, Dr. Diwan. What's your sense of the impact of the visit on bilateral relations, but also on the politics, especially inside Saudi Arabia? What do you think?
Well, I thought for the opening remarks, I wanted to take it really big picture because I think it's important. Everybody, we'll get into a little bit more of the details, but a lot of the details actually aren't very public. So that's a frustrating thing to analyze this. But if we take it really big picture, I think it's important to understand that the moment we're in sort of globally, we're at this moment of this really important energy transition where oil is not going to be at least as central as it has been for the last 50 years. And let's just pause a minute. This is the thing that runs the entire global economy. So this is a major, major, major transition, which Saudi Arabia had their position globally assured because of their being a source of cheap and plentiful oil. And also due to that, of course, we're going through within the kingdom a hugely ambitious economic diversification, that will allow them to withstand this, which also entails, which is just mentioned, a shift in the basis of their political legitimacy, at least over the last 30 years or so, and a new social contract. So the Saudis are managing a lot. It's a lot. So at this pivotal time, obviously the relations to the United States are really, really, really critical in how they transition that and where their position will be in this new evolving order. And so I think when you look at what the Saudis really big picture are trying to achieve, number one is relevance. They need to still keep their relevance and to be not only that, but a central player, somebody that really is going to have a say and be structured within this new economic framework and security architecture. And the second thing is they need regional stability because they can't undertake this transition if, with bombs flying over their heads towards Iran and with chaos on all of the borders. I mean, they've been doing a pretty good job actually to keep going. But long term, this is gonna, it's a huge, huge risk for them. So I think for me, what really comes out of it, I would agree that AI is huge because I think all of the players, if we look at our own economy in the stock market right now, and the investments and where huge money is going, everybody thinks that AI is this transformational new system. And so for Saudi Arabia to basically achieve access to these high level chips and to have all of these major AI companies coming and making deals with them, it basically plants them along with the UAE as being part of this new emerging architecture. And they've been able to basically translate their close ties, which Bernie talked about that they've been able to maintain, which wasn't a given, in the last 5 years or so. Plentiful cheap oil, of course, because energy is huge to what AI is trying to, to structuring AI. They're good tech infrastructure and lots of capital, a promised capital, which, AI needs that now. They need people to invest quickly so that they can really ramp up what they're doing. And I think that's going to be long term, really, really important for Saudi Arabia. They also have made some progress in the security agreement. Again, that's not very clear, but I agree with Hussein that at least they're continuing to deepen their relations with the United States, which is clear. There's going to be a lot more, not only arms purchases, but coordination on the ground, perhaps even looking towards, taking that further, even trying to get the US even further on the ground in Saudi Arabia. So progress there. And also, one thing I was looking for was to see if Saudi Arabia could still be an important, effective, impactful, and independent in their own sense from the United States voice on regional affairs. We know that they did that effectively in the first meeting when Trump visited Riyadh, when they were able to introduce Ahmed al-Shara to the equation and really get a breakthrough of the U.S. relations with that government in Syria, which has been hugely impactful, I think, in the region so far. And it looks like they were able to at least introduce that again for a topic that's very important to them, which is Sudan. So I found that interesting that they, again, Mohammed bin Salman was to put something on the radar for the Trump administration that they hadn't really been focused on, but that was important to Saudi Arabia.
So
And
he
we can also
appealed
talk about Iran. So
just to inform the viewers. Basically, to cut through the diplomatic jargon, the MBS appealed to Trump to get engaged with for actively looking for an end to the war in Sudan. That's essentially what happened, right? There was Saudi pressure on the U.S. to put this ending the war in Sudan on the American list of priorities. Something
Yeah.
like that.
And
Yeah.
it's hard. I mean, we all know the US has, a lot on their plate, even in the region. We know that probably the capabilities in some ways of the Trump policy bureaucracy is maybe not there what we would like it to be right now. But at least to get that, to be able to have that ability of setting, an agenda or resetting an agenda is a huge, well, I mean, being able to do it at least. I mean, we don't know how effective it's going to be, but to
Yeah.
set that agenda, I think is really important. I
Tell
mean,
you, tell you what.
that Mohammed bin Salman has established himself as somebody that the Trump administration will listen to.
Right.
And also that they've kept their own independent voice, which I think what Bernie was talking about on the issue of normalization and all that is quite important, that Saudi Arabia has set what their priorities are, and they've been able to do that and make progress on these other things while maintaining those political priorities.
That's a really good point. I'd like to table Sudan for a minute. I'd like to come back to it because I think it's a really fascinating question about, you know, what Saudi Arabia wants to do in terms of marshaling the bilateral relationship with Washington to address Sudan, or does it want the U.S. to approach it unilaterally or whatever? I have some thoughts, but we'll come back to it. But let's bring in Abdulrahman al-Rashed, an old friend. Great to see you. It's been well over 10, maybe
So,
15.
for some time. Thank you very much, Dr. Hussein, for inviting me.
No,
Appreciate it.
thank you so much for joining us. So, what's your big picture take on the aftermath of the visit? I think everyone agrees it was successful from both a Saudi and American point of view. How successful was it? And what do you think the big takeaways are?
Well, as you said, just the issue that the visit took it to place, that's, I think, in my opinion, was a success politically. Second, I can look at it from two things, two angles. One is uh, the previous kings who came to Washington, D.C., they don't come very often like Jordanian kings and others normally. They come like every 5, 6 years, you'll have probably a visit. And this one, I think it's remind me of King Fahad visit in the 80s when he came. I remember it was, they concluded the F-15 deal, then the AWACS deal. It was also balancing the power in the region with Iran-Iraq war. And we can also look at it, from a different angle, which is the Crown Prince himself came here in March, April in 2018. I look at it like a continuation from the earlier visit because when he came last time, uh, he was very much interested in the investment before even Trump was speaking about, PIF and other investments. And he spent few days at the Silicon Valley. He met all the tech executives and co-owners. This time, the same thing happened again. It's a continuation, which is, or let's say, crowned by deals, bigger deals than 2018. And President Trump brought all these executives to DC to rather than going to the Silicon Valley. So I think we have a success visit comparing to the previous visit and comparing to others. And it's like Christmas came early this time, a few weeks earlier. And we have the nuclear framework, we have the defense agreement, which is more defined comparing what it was the past 10 years when President Obama spoke of the region and Saudi as irrelevant somehow to the strategic matters to the US. So I think let's say this visit stabilized the relationship between Saudi and the United States. Extremely important in in this way, if we look at it. Second, it stabilized also the relationship between the two powers, China and the United States. So I think there are many questions somehow being solved right now. We have a defense agreement, and we have a good relationship between Saudi and China as the a consumer of oil, Saudis. So if you look at it this way, it's quite interesting. And the neighbors, as Trump normally says, this is a tough neighborhood. Investing these almost $1 trillion between Saudis and Americans, it needs a lot of, kind of protection as well. Today, we heard one of the Iranian ministers, he spoke warning the Gulf countries that do not look at us in the 12 days war with Israel as we are weak. We are not weak, we're still strong. And Shamkhani, he was talking to the GCC leaders were convening in Bahrain, which is quite unusual, to be honest. So I think, yeah, I think the visit was important, whether we're talking about politics or we're talking about bilateral relations with the United States in particular, or obviously, uh, in dealing with the larger scale relationship with China and others.
What aspect of this is so unusual, regarding the meeting in Bahrain? What are you? I just want the viewers to be clear about what you're identifying as unusual.
The GCC, they have annual meeting.
Yeah,
So all the six countries, the leaders of the six countries,
they
they
meet.
convened as usual in December in Bahrain, and they spoke normally as backing up Emirate about its islands, occupied islands by the Iranians. That's the point of view of the GCC countries.
That's all normal.
Yeah, and I think it's about another the Arish island also in the
Yeah.
with Kuwait and the gas field, etc. So really nothing extraordinary in my opinion. But the most unusual uh, issue here is the Tehran came up with this denouncing the GCC and. In a way, a threat, saying, "Well, do not look at us as weak, since the
Okay.
Israeli attacked us."
So so what was unusual was the vociferous Iranian response,
Indeed, indeed,
and not the GCC conduct, all of which was
that's right.
typical and standard. Okay, well, that's very helpful. So let's pursue the China angle with Professor Haykel for a second. My sense also is that Saudi Arabia, of the three close partners of the United States militarily in the region, Israel, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, that Saudi Arabia has been most cautious of the three over the past decade, not to test Washington's toleration for getting close to China in ways that might alarm people in the U.S. and that at the same time building stronger bilateral relations with China, both even just in terms of trade, but in every way, provides alternatives and builds a kind of a strategic diversification that just exists anyway. What's your take on where the status of the Beijing, Washington, Riyadh triangle, if you can put it that way, if there is, or even if there is such a thing, which I think there is, but you might not.
So, it's really important to understand that the Crown Prince, and I think the advisors and the leadership around him, are very pragmatic people, and they don't have illusions about the nature of power and the structures of power in the world. So they have actually, well, I mean, they didn't do what the UAE did, which is to allow for a while the Chinese to build a naval base and then have it discovered by the US and then then stop it.
Or
But
Huawei, or work too closely with Huawei for the
yeah,
United
so
States.
so they've been careful about that. But they have actually um, engaged China it is their engagement with China over the détente agreement with Iran that actually finally snapped the Biden administration's attention that, the Chinese are involving themselves in ways that are unacceptable to the US. And that's what actually started the thaw, in addition to the Biden administration's wanting the Saudis to produce more oil, which never materialized. But the Saudis have been very careful and very good at engaging the Chinese, also buying weapon systems from the Chinese that the Americans are not willing to sell them. For instance, armed drones, which the U.S. was not willing to do. Now President Trump is willing to sell the MQ-9 with weapons. So. But at the same time, the Saudis, I think, understand that the Chinese don't have the force projection, and that when they're asked to behave or to adopt policies that are in favor of Saudi Arabia, such as, for instance, uh, putting a bridle or reining in the Iranians and the Houthis in particular, the Chinese, instead of doing that, cut their own deal with the Houthis for their ships. So, they realize that their security is still deeply entwined with the United States, although the United States is not always reliable, as we saw in September 2019, and that, they have to sometimes, to get America's attention, they have to engage the Chinese, and that does often work, in fact, almost always. And yet, they have to also trade with the Chinese. So, they're involved in this extremely complex set of balancing, wanting to be in a Catholic marriage with the Americans, but having a mistress as with the Chinese as a mistress, and that's a complicated, business to engage in. But they do it quite well, I think.
Well, yeah, more skillfully than Israel or the UAE because there hasn't been a big eruption, even over OPEC Plus, which it looked like was going to boil over under Biden and then didn't because the price of oil didn't spike for various reasons. Anyway, what's your take, Dr. Diwan? What do you make of the state of this triangular relationship?
I think Bernie covered it,
Yeah.
honestly.
Okay.
I think it's pretty well covered.
Okay, that's good. And I was wondering if Abdulrahman Rashid had any thoughts on the China factor in U.S.-Saudi relations. I think there is still room to say something a bit more, but I invite you. You're still muted, Abdulrahman. You have to unmute. Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
I agree with Bernie. Yeah, I think now I call it stabilized, both sides, because the Chinese have been very pragmatic in dealing with Saudis. Saudi is very close to the United States. The defense agreement, we haven't heard any kind of negative reaction to it from Beijing. So I think this is quite interesting. And I think so far Saudis have been quite elegant in the way dealing with the Chinese and the Americans at
Yeah.
the same time. Everyone has their own share in the country, whether economically or politically speaking. So just look at it. The Chinese broke the deal between Saudi and Iran when we thought it was quite difficult to do. Until now, the deal is still on, and it has been proven to be beneficial during the confrontation between Israel and Iran for all parties, actually. So I think the Chinese are happy with that. The Saudis now strengthening their position by signing the defense agreement,
Mm.
having the F-35 deal as well, and the tanks. It will also strengthen the deterrence uh, policy by the Saudis vis-a-vis Iran. So I think always we look at China in terms of a oil market as an importer, and I don't see a problem with that in dealing with the Americans as a strategic partner.
Mm. So let me stick with you for a second, Abdurrahman, if I could. David Ottaway, and there are these intersecting questions that I want to combine from David Ottaway and Nimrod Novik, which that simply gives an indication of the quality of our audience here right now, which is obviously very high. David Ottaway is asking about why there wasn't a similar U.S. security commitment to the one given recently to Qatar after the Israeli attack on Qatar. We don't know that it hasn't been. We just don't know the nature of the new understanding. But it is likely, I think, that if it had been at that level, we would have heard more about it. Meanwhile, Nimrod Novik is asking if Trump is keeping a more robust security guarantee in his pocket for when normalization becomes more with Israel becomes more of a plausible Saudi policy. And he's wondering, are Israelis fantasizing when they think that? So these questions intersect. What about the security guarantee and relationship with with Israel?
Is that for me, Dr.
Yeah,
Hussein?
I want to start
Okay.
with
Well,
and then
I
I'll
mean,
go to agreement with
I
it.
mean, Israelis, they have the habit, of course, of complaining. They don't want any of the neighboring countries to be armed or having the access to American defense weapons. We understand that. But I mean, we have an excellent experience in this matter with the AWACS and with the F-15 before, proven to be useful during the wartime when
Yeah,
in 1990. So the AWACS was extremely important, but we did not even predict that Saddam Hussein was going to invade
right.
Kuwait. But it's, in
It
this
happened.
region, we have a lot of shit show goes on, not unusual. And
Definitely.
I don't think there is a reason. Israel is a superior power, should be not that afraid of Saudis or Egyptians or anybody else. But you cannot really allow Saudi to be vulnerable so to please Israelis. That's not the point. So the vulnerability of Saudi for Iranian attack in the future will weaken the American strategic interest in the area. So I think Saudis and Americans have great interest to have a strong Saudi. And I don't know really the details of the agreement, but I haven't heard really objections from even those who are normally the other side in the Congress, the other aisle.
Right.
So far it looks fine. I'm sure when it goes to the Congress, some of these agreements, if it does, I'm sure they would reach an agreement on certain conditions, but it's too early to talk about that. It's a framework right now.
Okay, so your sense of the defense agreement is that it doesn't have that much specific in it yet, so that it's not really ready for
I,
um,
I don't know about the specifics because,
yeah, we don't
I
know.
haven't seen it at least. I'm not an expert in military
No,
matters.
it's kind of striking, Professor Haykel, that we really have heard nothing about its contents, at least in public. There are rumors, but what have you heard anything interesting? I haven't much, and it isn't being reported on. So, what do you think, Professor Haykel?
So the question about why did the Saudis not get the same thing as Qatar? I mean,
Yeah.
I think that it's important to look at the world from the perspective of people in the region. So, Saudi Arabia is the 800-pound gorilla in the region and does not want to be equated with Qatar. So whatever it gets, it wants is going to have to be better than Qatar,
Right.
which is just an executive order, um, and will lapse with the passing, of to a new administration, unless the new administration, keeps it. So the Saudis want something more. As I said initially, they're ultimately aiming for an alliance, a treaty alliance, and that's a long-term project. So I think that so that's something that needs to be kept in mind. Second, I think that from what I heard about the agreement, that it involves a more streamlined and a quicker way to buy weapons. That's always been a source of tension in the relationship. So ultimately, the Saudis want to buy weapons in a way that is comparable, say, to a NATO ally. So you don't have, endless hurdles in Congress for this. I heard that there were basing rights and certain basing agreements with U.S. forces. This is something that we already got a hint of. Remember when Iran attacked Qatar after the 12-day war? The forces from al-Udeid were moved to Prince Sultan Air Base. And this is a source of pride for the Saudis that really ultimately, the strategic depth in the region is not on the Gulf, it's inside Saudi Arabia. And so I imagine it's that kind of thing that was in the agreement.
Mhm. That makes a lot of sense. Dr. Diwan, what have you heard?
Yeah, I was going to say the same. I think that a lot of the discussions that were going on between the security professionals about deepening that relationship on the ground, both in terms of the coordination and cooperation, between the two militaries, much more granular things. And I do think this basing agreement is interesting that we're moving back more in that direction. If you want to make the argument that they didn't get what the countries got, which is basically saying if you're attacked, we will come to your, protection. I think that's kind of a more representation of the extraordinary position of Qatar after they were attacked first by the Israelis and the need to make up and to reassure them from a situation which really left them completely vulnerable. And second, the fact that they have the al-Udeid Air Base, which is critically important to the U.S. military and really has been hugely important to having them stand out in the region and for their security guarantees. So I think the Saudi is looking again to that and wanting more basing in Saudi Arabia kind of speaks to the depth of that relationship. To the first question you asked just on
Yeah.
Israel, I don't really read it the way I guess the questions that we got from our listeners were suggesting it. I mean, to me, the bigger picture is that Saudi Arabia is succeeding in getting further along in their security agreement, and they've managed to sort of detach that from during the
Yeah,
Biden administration, which was a lockstep, right? It was like we will go
right.
forward on security agreements and on all of these mutual deepening of our security relationship once you do normalization, or they would go together. And I think really they have managed to separate that. So I don't really see
Well,
it. I mean, I think the F-35s, is there on the table for the Saudis to purchase. So I don't really see that the Trump administration is holding something back for, the agreement with the Israelis. To me, it looks more the weight's a little bit on the other way that the Saudis are making progress in
yeah.
getting their defense ties without having to surrender on that issue until they move forward on what their demands are, which is very much to see more tangible steps towards a Palestinian state and greater Palestinian representation. So,
That's sort of where I wanted to go with the conversation exactly. Let me circle right back to Professor Haykel. To what extent can Saudi Arabia ultimately get what it wants, which you rightly framed in terms of a kind of a very heavy, almost generational lift in, really a categorical shift in the nature of the, defense relationship versus the sort of smaller achievements that Kristin was just outlining. Um, how far can they get with in decoupling that defense agenda, bilateral defense agenda, from the question of normalization that it was hooked to for quite a while, especially under Biden?
Um, so, if you look at, let me just say something about the F-15s first before I answer your question. I'm going to guess and speculate here, but I think the Saudis will never buy the F-35. Sorry, I was talking about the F-35.
Yeah,
And the reason for that is because they are extremely um, um, sensitive about questions of sovereignty. And if the F-35 has a kill switch on it, or it has all kinds of restrictions about how it can be used,
it's
not
going
to
to.
mention how expensive it is, they're not going to go for it.
Okay.
Also, they're aware that the world has kind of moved after the Ukraine war to different kinds of platforms with drones being extremely effective. And so, they're not stupid and they're not going to go for something that's super expensive and unusable, especially if it has all kinds of restrictions. So that's just one point I want to
Same
put out
fate.
there.
You predict the same fate as the UAE sale. That
Yeah, and
ultimately
you
the
know, and
consumer will say, not for me, thanks.
yeah, and also that this is this is a significant change. They're not in the relationship. They're not just procurers of weapon systems to keep American companies afloat. They're going to buy stuff and kit that really makes sense for them. And I think that's also an important distinction between, say, Mohammed bin Salman and King Fahd. Um, uh, and it tells you that the relationship has changed. The other point on normalization, you know, the Saudis, and I share this view, by the way, the Saudis think that as long as the Palestinian issue is unresolved, it is a source of radicalization and tension in the region. And you will have spoilers like Iran and others constantly meddling and creating instability, which is bad for the region. It's bad for Saudi. It's bad for the project of diversification, economic modernization of the country and of the region. So you need to solve that problem in order to move on. And in fact, to integrate Israel economically, technologically, and militarily into a structure that will keep the spoilers, in check. Here, read Iran. So that's the kind of strategic vision. And someone like Mohammed bin Salman is not looking at 2 years or 4 years. He's looking at 10, 20, 30 years ahead. And this is an issue that eventually will have to be resolved in that way. Um, I don't think he's like a short-term person, unless, of course, the Israelis are willing to see the world in that way and then come to some sort of accommodation with the Palestinians. He's not going to dictate the terms of that accommodation. That's for the Israelis and Palestinians to decide. But that's how he sees the problem. And he also similarly sees the problem in the war in Sudan and Yemen. Um, in similar terms. These are countries that are sources of great instability, and in the case of both Sudan and Yemen, are in fact a much more immediate strategic threat to Saudi Arabia, and therefore he wants those conflicts ended so that he can get on with the business of modernizing.
Yeah, no, I think very good point. Let me come back to Abdulrahman, if I might. One of our listeners wants to know if Saudi Arabia can lead mediation efforts between U.S. and Iran. That's an interesting thought. Any interest, any possibility? Seems far-fetched to me, but I don't know. I think it might, who knows?
Well, it's far-fetched to me too, but I mean, it's not impossible because Iran has been looking for a backdoor to talk to the administration in Washington, and I think Iran will go with anyone can help them. Even I remember Putin proposed that he will be a mediator, if you remember, about a few months ago. So depends really on what Iran has to offer in this case. If Iran is changing a lot, which we have not seen a sign of that yet, I think Saudis probably will be helpful in this matter. But if Iran is really just looking for a place to negotiate, let's say a location, and they will have a room to sit the Americans and the Iranians to negotiate, I think, yeah, I mean, this is just, they can find a hotel somewhere in Switzerland or anywhere else in the Gulf countries. I don't think, this is really matters to the Saudis. This is my personal opinion. But I believe Iran will need the support of Saudi, who they're, the antagonist in this matter, who can work with the Iranians on a reasonable deal, can be presented to the Americans.
Mm.
The whole thing really in the hands of the Iranians, not in the hands of the Americans, in my opinion. So we will see, but I doubt it very much, really. I don't think Iran itself is ready for a big change. If there is no big change, I see negotiation would be just really minimum at this stage.
That
Can I
strikes
say
me.
something on that
Of
too?
course.
Well, one, I wanted to bring attention to a blog that was submitted by Ali Alfoni, which hopefully we can share it in the chat, and bring his perspective into. And I think the problem for Saudi Arabia is Iran is still the biggest sort of threat for them, I think. I mean, we can talk about Israel's greater emergence too, but Iran is still the big threat. And
Mhm.
there is this danger with Saudi Arabia, coming to Washington, demonstrating this closer relationship to the Americans, deepening the defense agreement with the Americans, and at the same time, by the way, being much more active in Syria and in Lebanon and showing much more interest in sort of playing a big role there. Um, they have to balance things, and this is what Ali makes the argument um, with Iran by kind of showing this willingness to try to bring Iran and some kind of resolution with the US along, right? And so there was this whole discussion about a letter beforehand that was given by Brzezinski, and I'm not sure. I never heard definitively if that was just a letter to MBS or it was supposed to go to Trump. But I think the willingness of Saudi to show that they're being sort of an emissary, and also just to keep pressing this issue, because I think that is long-term a danger for them, or short-term a danger is if things start to escalate again with either the US or Iran or Israel and Iran. That's a major threat to Saudi Arabia, and in fact to all of the Gulf states. So I think that sort of balance in this visit, and trying to show that they're not being hostile to Iran in this visit is an important kind of signaling, if not even getting something more substantial from that.
Thank you for that. By the way, a link to the essay by Ali Al-Foneh is now available to everyone in the chat feature of Zoom. Professor Haykel, were you going to add something? I might
Yeah,
have
I mean,
missed
look, I just want to tell your viewers, you should listen very carefully to what Abdulrahman is saying.
Yeah,
Abdulrahman is saying that the Iranians are basically, first, the regime hasn't changed, and the regime is threatening. That people in the regime are threatening. The message that, they're still powerful, don't think that the 12-day war has weakened us. That's a direct threat. And
yeah.
in conversations between the Iranian officials and the Saudi leadership, there are direct threats that are made. And the Saudi leadership is, the country is vulnerable. It has a lot of vital infrastructure that can be targeted by missiles and drones. And so the Saudis have been very careful to signal their neutrality, that, they will not pick sides in the war between Israel and Iran. They don't want to be attacked. But, should they be attacked, they will have to take sides. And in the meantime, they're trying to beef up their defenses so that they're not as vulnerable to an Iranian attack, which they're convinced would happen if the Israelis
Yeah.
attack again and the Iranian regime is existentially threatened. The
I think a
Iranians will
lot
go
of us
all
are
out.
convinced. Yeah, a lot of us are convinced that, the Gulf countries are obvious targets of retaliation, no matter how much they try to get out of the way. And I mean, the other thing is that, to be fair, in 2019 they joined a more aggressive U.S. campaign of containment against Iran, and they got punched in the face at Abqaiq and Khurais, and then nobody did anything. So that really is not an experience anyone
And
would
also,
repeat.
and also saying they have a lot to lose. I mean, God forbid,
Yeah,
imagine if some of the towers in Dubai were attacked by Iranian missiles. What would happen to the UAE? Or,
the whole model would fall apart.
yeah, or the desalination plants in Saudi Arabia. Those are countries that have built a lot of infrastructure, and that is crucial to their continuation. A similar attack on Lebanon or Iraq or Syria won't have, or Yemen doesn't have the same effect.
No, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. And there is no country that has, as the failure of Israel's Arrow system, which was pretty dramatic in the first Iranian salvo, which either failed on launch or got through. They just hit irrelevant places because of lack of, lack of targeting and lack of many things. But it's not as if Arrow was successful in shooting down a bullet with a bullet, and that's not a nut that technology has cracked yet in general. You can have layers of missile defense, but no country has a comprehensive missile defense that cannot be overwhelmed with all kinds of things, including dummy drones and all, I mean, really cheap solutions to very expensive anti-missile systems. So it's just sort of pointless. To take us in a slightly more upbeat direction, that rather downbeat moment, where it is really, I think, undoubtedly true that Saudi Arabia lives under, and the other Gulf countries continue to live under a cloud of threat from Iran. And there isn't that, the other crucial thing that people should understand is that there isn't all that much these countries can do about it. And they try to get out of the way. They've developed their bilateral relationship with Iran. They've tried to make it clear that they're not taking sides at it. But ultimately, if the Iranians do decide that that retaliation is the preferred course, they are very likely to be struck. They think, and I think, and I think everybody I know who's serious about this also thinks. So their anxieties are well placed. One of our anonymous attendees wants to know something a little bit less dark, though perhaps interesting. This person asks, can you talk a little bit about what 1,000-person delegation looks like? I'm struggling to wrap my head around it, especially for a visit that was only a few days. I want everyone here who wants to discuss that to mention it or to try to tackle it. I will simply say that the human presence and traffic at the major hotels in Washington, beginning with the Four Seasons and including the others, was dramatically impacted. This presence was felt in lobbies and hotel restaurants and floors throughout DC during those days. I saw it. I saw it a few days in advance. I saw it during the trip and after the trip. It was really noteworthy. And so I think a bunch of hoteliers made a bunch of cash. But in addition to that, I don't know what it looked like behind the scenes. And if any of the three, or all, hopefully, of the three of you would like to comment on the nature of a 1,000-person delegation for a few-day trip, I'd be grateful.
I guess you're talking about me in this case because
Well, I'm talking to all three of you, but
I
you're a
was staying
great
at the
person.
St. Regis, Dr. Hussein, so I am one of the 1,000. So
Was it 1,000?
Yeah, it was
exactly, I
1,000.
don't know. The number is 100
Well,
or
you were
1,000.
you were at
1,001. You were the 1,001 guest.
yeah, Scheherazade, yeah, absolutely, Alfred Walid, yeah,
Look,
but listen,
this,
you were at the state dinner also, Abdulrahman, were you
yeah,
not?
we were.
Yeah,
Saudis were only about, I don't know, 16 people. We were there. The rest were for the American side.
Americans,
So,
of course, naturally speaking, that's always the
and
case.
the president kept complaining that the room is too small. But anyhow,
Well, he's building a bigger one. You might have heard.
well, good
Um,
for him.
Anyway, but anything you can tell us about what it was like would be helpful because
It's not the crown prince only visit. It's just many delegations accompanied the crown prince in bilateral negotiation, energy, economics, private sector. So many businessmen came with
right,
accompanied the visit as well. And they dealt if you remember the investment conference
sure.
at the Kennedy Center was packed also with different Saudi, mostly non-officials, by the way. So
But
this is really mostly
business
were
leaders, right?
non-officials,
Yeah,
mostly.
yeah,
But I'm sure there are some security and others, but and from the military side because they
sure.
have also some other dealings in the energy and the economics and the military. But it was a big visit in terms of importance, in term of negotiation, and at the end of the day, it's the proof in the pudding. I think it has proven to be very successful in all levels, really. So
So it's
the number is 1,000 or 200. I don't know really. That's not the point.
1,001. We've established in the
Yes,
traditional
I am the one.
manner.
I
Can you
confess.
كان يا ما كان في قدر
Okay.
الزمان. Anyway, look, what about what's your sense of things? Either Bernie or Kristin, either of you have any thoughts on this 1,000-person delegation? I mean, it did strike me as large, but maybe not insanely large. I don't know.
I'll just note one thing. It seemed like much more centralized this time, which is interesting. I think it's more telling about both the prioritization and also maybe tells us something about the U.S. and how we're doing relations now too. Um, I think Abdulrahman Rashid mentioned the first MBS visit, and I was very
Yeah.
struck by in that visit. It was very much like this traveling. I won't call it a circus, but it was a traveling
Oh, but it was a
delegation
grand
that
tour of the U.S.,
it was
right?
like a 2 week long trip. He went up to, Boston and met with the universities. He went to Silicon Valley. He went to Hollywood. He went to Houston.
Houston, yeah.
Yeah, this trip was very focused on the leadership, on President Trump, and on this investment conference.
Well, and Mike Johnson, right? There
Yeah,
was
and Congress, I
important
guess,
outreach to Congress, to
which I think
Republicans.
we also had a question about. But I think it
We
was much more
did.
centered in Washington. And interestingly, all the business people, very high level, extremely important, the most important business heads in finance and tech and stuff, I think came here
Right.
to Washington. And it was a very centralized kind of meeting, which struck me as a little bit unusual from the American point of view, which usually we're a little bit more like you have to go around and see everybody because we don't have such a centralized system. But I think it was for this visit that's really the case. And it was much less even around the think tanks and that kind of public
I
communication, just
know.
really, really centered between the leadership in Riyadh and the leadership in Washington, and the business people that they had assembled and the officials. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. In addition, I would note an inverse proportionality between the size of the delegation, the amount of information and scuttlebutt that was circulating. It was striking. You'd think that with 1,001 people, there would be a lot of rumors and a lot more leaking than there was. I noticed not, rather less than usual, which struck me anyway. Any thoughts on the giant delegation, Bernie?
I mean, not really. I know that over 1,000 visas were issued, but the actual delegation was between, I think, 700 and some people. It wasn't 1,000. There were
Okay,
two to 300 businessmen.
constructive hyperbole, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
fine. Yeah.
But as I said, I mean, there were earlier on, this was very a symbolic visit, for the Crown Prince. It was a quasi-state visit, and it was
Yeah.
important to show, that a lot of Saudis were here and signing agreements and so on. It played very well back home.
Yeah, which is really, of course, crucially important, and it sets the stage for the next one. So we talked beforehand about the kind of rehabilitation that is being done in stages, with the inflection point coming in Riyadh, right, with the fist bump or Jeddah, excuse me, the Jeddah fist bump with Biden. That was sort of the key turning point. But in general, there is this sort of stage by stage, um, you know, rehabilitation of MBS in the United States after a real low point that was not functional. Somebody points out that FDR had 5 aides when meeting Abdulaziz bin Saud, and now it's going to be 1,000 Americans plus for any meeting, any trip to Saudi Arabia, etc. Damian Jones wants to know about the impact of bilateral U.S.-Saudi ties with Pakistan and Turkey as a hedging strategy and strategic diversification in terms of adding leverage with Washington and perhaps adding more depth to the Saudi security portfolio beyond just the bilateral with the U.S. and especially as a potential response to Israel's growing regional dominance in the security realm. So let me turn to Abdulrahman on that one. What do you think?
I'm not sure really the close relationship between now Saudi and Turkey or the defense pact with Pakistan is directly against Israel. I think that's a little bit. Uh, I don't see it this way because what would Pakistan do in the case of Israeli attack? I mean, I don't see how. If you talk about nuclear, balance, it has nothing to do with nuclear. Also, balance of power here. No, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, the country between the two is Iran. If
Yeah.
you look at the geopolitical situation. So yes, I think it's trying to strengthen and to hedge for Saudi against all the threats in the region, including Iran. I think the defense pact with Pakistan is quite uh, speaks for itself because it was somehow without counterpact. There was an agreement between Pakistan and Saudi during the tension in the 80s and the 70s, and the Pakistanis were, quick to help Saudi at that time.
We looked in our other webinars, we looked in detail at
Yeah,
the deep history.
yeah. So I think it's to do with the Iranian threat and similar. Uh, it's a deterrence, not really anything else. The second part is with Turkey. The defense agreement with Turkey is because Turkey now is quite recognized as a military industrial country in the region when it comes to drones and others. And Saudis they have signed deals with Turkey on this matter. So I believe Turkey is now becoming more closer to Saudi than any time before. We had a brief time of crisis, but right now, Turkey is very close to Saudi and they coordinate on many issues in the region. So
Not
I don't
least
see
with
it. I don't see
Syria.
it really. Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi versus Israel. Israel is has nothing to do with it.
I agree with that. I think that's right. Would either of the two of you want to chime in on that, Kristin or Bernie, or shall we go on to the next question?
I'll
Up to
just
you.
say really briefly, I think the point that you were making, Hussein, that it has been interesting to see the Saudi um, kind of balance shifting towards Turkey, especially I think as Saudi Arabia is moving into more interest in the Levant, especially Syria. We've seen more points of coordination than we saw previously. And I think when you look at the regional powers too, and who the different countries as they look, this is kind of looking away from the US relationship now, but look at the regional powers and how they can arrange themselves in the region. Obviously, it's Iran and Turkey and Israel. And I think, although the Emiratis had kind of leaned towards Israel as one of the strong powers that they could, work with, Israel's looking much more less attractive and more threatening. And I think that in that sense, it's linked to the relations with Turkey, just that Turkey
Yeah.
looks like a more promising large power that perhaps they can build closer relations in some of these matters in the region.
There has been a broad reassessment of Israel's relationship to stability and security. That's for sure. Bernie, unless you have thoughts about all of that, I'd like to turn back to the tabled issue of Sudan. I think it's clear that MBS appealed to Trump to get more involved in Sudan and to make Sudan more of a U.S. priority than it has been, which it hasn't been at all. But to make it kind of an agenda item for U.S. foreign policy in general. The question then becomes, what is Saudi Arabia hoping to achieve here? Is it looking for U.S. leadership? Is it looking for a bilateral U.S.-Saudi push to resolve the war in Sudan? Is it looking for the U.S. to bless a Saudi-led effort? I mean, what is the goal here beneath the headline?
So let me just address a couple of points that were made earlier, and then I'll talk about the Sudan, and because they're connected. So first, on the question of the rehabilitation, I mean, if you looked at the press conference in the Oval Office, it was pretty clear that MBS was the kind of adult in the room, and that he was addressing issues, kind of in a very systematic and measured way, and including, the question of 9/11 and Saudi Arabia's alleged, involvement in that attack, and also the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. The question of Turkey, I would just quickly point to you that Turkey uses non-state actors. It uses Islamists in particular to spread its influence in the region, and that is not something that Saudi Arabia looks favorably upon. Israel does not do that. Israel doesn't kind of engage with non-state actors. In fact, it threatens to attack Islamists everywhere, as it's doing in Yemen, for instance, with the Houthis, which is something that the Saudis have taken note of and are not too displeased with. On the Sudan, again, Turkey is involved there, but most importantly, it's the UAE there. And I think that as Saudi Arabia looks to the Sudan, it sees a country where you have a genocide going on with the Rapid Support Forces. And you have 1 million Sudanese residents in Saudi Arabia, and there's a real threat of a flood of refugees coming from the Sudan across the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia. So it wants the end of that war. It wants the RSF to be stopped. And clearly, I think whatever discussions have happened between the Saudis and the Emiratis have not led to that happening. So the hope, I think, is for the U.S. to put pressure so that the RSF is stopped, and funding and the military support ceases, so that we can see an end to that civil war. The Saudis are not enamored necessarily with Burhan and the Sudanese army, again because there are Islamists in that army, but it's the better choice. It's the better of two evils. And I think the attitude to Syria is very similar. Again, it's one where they're willing to work with Sharar. He's not ideal, but he's better than the alternative, which is chaos. And certainly you want to have some influence in Syria so that the Turks don't take over completely and establish an Islamist regime in that country.
Yeah, I'd like to apologize to everyone, including our viewers. I lost my internet connection for about 2 minutes or 3 minutes there, so I was simply absent. And I'm wondering if Kristin or Abdulrahman have not commented on the question of U.S. and Saudi policy towards Sudan, if they would like to. And if not, then we can move on. But I'm guessing they haven't.
I could just answer. I think
Please.
Bernard answered your issue about what they're hoping to achieve, and I agree with that. And that, especially to look at the horrible human toll right now, and that basically what has been put in place hasn't been working. We kind of reached a stalemate or a worsening of the war. But your question of how they want to go about it, at least as we look at the steps that have been taken since the appeal, they are still working through the quad diplomacy that was there before. So it's not looking like a completely new kind of thing. It's just more activation on the U.S. role. We had basically the envoy, God, I'm blanking on his name right now.
Yeah. And so then the question becomes...
Envoy has been going to the UAE. He was in a public meeting with Anwar Gargash there. So clearly there were some quiet diplomacy behind the scenes. We don't know what happened there, but let's just say more active engagement by Boutros, sorry, I'm just blanking on his name, who's the main envoy there. And they've reactivated the proposed peace roadmap for the ceasefire that was put in place, I think, by the Quad. So I think Masad Boulos. So yeah, I think it's mostly working, a more active U.S. presence working through the Quad arrangement, which has already been put in place on Sudan, is what they're hoping to get more results.
Yeah. All right. Well, another question that arises has to do with so U.S. and Saudi engagement on Lebanon. And the Lebanese file appears to be particularly dynamic at the moment. It appears to me to be particularly dynamic. So I'm wondering if you think this is a a fertile or particularly rich area for potential bilateral cooperation. Let's start with Bernie and see what the other two of you think.
I don't think that Lebanon is as important, to the Saudis as it once was. They have a clear assessment of strategic threats, and Lebanon is not one of them. The Saudi position on Lebanon, in fact, is very similar to the American position. It's also similar to the Israeli position, which is that as long as Hezbollah doesn't disarm, it's they're not going to help. And that also, in addition to Hezbollah disarming, the government has to restructure its the banking system. They have to fix the corruption. And without that, the Saudis are not going to waste their money as they have for many decades. I mean, some 10, 20, 30 billion dollars over decades under the Hariris, and most of it was stolen. And so now they're not going to repeat that mistake. And Syria is more important to them than Lebanon is, and the Lebanese have to get their act together. I think that's their view on Lebanon. It's not a top priority, frankly. And you can see it from the person that they've appointed as the liaison or the person who's managing Lebanon. I mean, it's not he's a very well, informed person, but he's not very important in the hierarchy of the Saudi administration.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on to another question is, what about Saudi Emirati competition on AI? Because both countries have been pushing AI very hard and trying to use the relationship with the US to advance their AI agenda. Is it in harmony? Is it in competition, as some people say? Is it, is there a sense that each is trying to win over the US, or are both vying to kind of position the Gulf as part of an American-led global alternative to exclusive Chinese dominance in that field? Let me start with Abdulrahman on that.
If you don't mind, I'll just want to go back to the issue of Sudan. As Bernie
Yeah,
said,
no, please.
yeah, as because Sudan is just has an immediate impact on Saudi more than anybody else, probably except with the exception of Egypt. It's quite an important because Saudi is actually the ones negotiated a deal in Jeddah, and it's called Jeddah now agreement between the two warring parties in Sudan, and both sides agreed to it, and they went back again, unfortunately, to fighting. So Saudis have quite strong interest to see this issue resolved in Sudan, and with the help from President Trump, will be quite will end up will end this kind of horrible situation we have, which is somehow neglected in the media. But it's a big war in Sudan right now, and yes, I think it has to do a lot with Saudi interest as well, because you have more than 1 million Sudanese who live in Saudis, and a lot of them would be, coming through the sea, through Yemen to Saudis, refugees if the war continues. Regarding the technology race, it's quite interesting, don't you think so, Dr. Hussein, to see?
Certainly do.
Yeah, I mean it's a positive competition. I see it. If Saudis are investing in technology, and the Emiratis and probably the Qataris, I think they are. It's quite something we should really encourage more, and I think it's happening right now. As Benny said before, the Saudis, they have the depth, they have the markets, they have yet a lot of advantages. But yes, I think the visit of the Crown Prince has a lot to do with the technology side, which I said he
Mhm.
started from 2018 in dealing with the Silicon Valley companies. So yes, there is a competition, and I see it as a positive competition between the two countries.
Mhm. Do you agree with that, Bernie?
So, I'm not an expert on AI. I don't know if
Me
there's
neither.
overcapacity, is possible. I mean, on the one hand, you can think of it as how many airlines do you need and how many airports do you need, which is this typical competition that you see between different GCC countries. They each have their own airline and so on. Think of Emirates, Etihad, etc. Now Air
Mhm.
Riyadh, actually. And so there may be, an oversupply, a lot of unneeded AI. Who knows? I mean, I'm not an expert, but what I do know is that the Saudis, and to some extent the Emiratis, but the Saudis more than Emiratis, have tremendous comparative advantage because the land is owned by the government. Because they can, essentially give a lot of land out. They have cheap energy, some of the cheapest energy in the world, between gas and solar and wind. Um, they have a low regulatory environment. In fact, they can have no regulation whatsoever if they choose to.
Yeah.
Those are remarkable kind of advantages that means that you can build out data centers and research centers in record time. The one that's now been deployed by HSTC, I think it's called, out in Phoenix, Arizona. Impossible. I mean, the regulatory system in the US has made it nearly impossible to build it out. Whereas in the kingdom, you could do that very quickly. Of course, in the UAE as well, kingdom has much more land, has much more energy, though, at its disposal.
Yeah, absolutely. Kristin, any thoughts on competition, healthy, positive, perhaps less so?
Yeah, I'll note a couple of things. One, we do have Robert Mogilnicki, who's our scholar. It's kind of a
Yeah,
specialist in political economy and very interested in technological issues. He wrote a piece both before the visit on what the expectations were and then what actually came out of it on the AI front
yeah.
specifically. So hopefully we could share both of those pieces in the chat. Um, and kind of drawing from him and what I said kind of in my intro remarks, I just think it's very important to be in this game. It's clearly a hugely important game that's going on. I think the UAE was way ahead. Um, I think they've been working at this for a number of years. And I think it's the critical entry point is to get access to the chips so that you can provide one of these data centers. And so I think, the UAE had already gotten those promises, which I think we're still kind of working their way through regulatory here in
Mhm.
the US. I think the fact that Saudi Arabia also got them is hugely important. So I think my sense of it, and again, I'm not an expert either, and hopefully you'll look to Robert's pieces and others, but is that right now the need for rapid expansion is such that probably both of them can play a role. I think
Well,
the UAE seems to have more, they even have like their own high level university too on AI. So I think they're probably better positioned to kind of broaden their overall capacity and benefit from having the data centers on soil. But I think definitely once they're given this key access point, which is the chips, which now Saudi Arabia has been given, they can both play an important role, and it's a very important achievement of the visit.
yeah. Um, Let me, let's just say, I mean, is there any possibility that the highest level NVIDIA chips could go the way of the F-35 sales? By the way, the piece that Robert Moganiki wrote is now available on the chat. But in other words, what the UAE experience seems to suggest is that it's one thing to get a promise from the administration, and another to actually get these very sensitive chips released to you. And I could just leave that hanging there as an observation, unless any of the three of you would care to comment on that ongoing gap, the gap between promises and delivery.
I mean, the statement was released from the administration that the approval has been given, so we'll
Yeah,
see. I mean, how it plays out. Again, I don't follow in great detail, but I think that was an advancement.
yeah, undoubtedly, at least aspirationally, but we'll see who gets what in the end.
Yeah,
Um,
that was for both UAE. I mean, and the UAE made a statement afterwards as well. So the statement
exactly.
came out both for Saudi Arabia and also for the UAE.
That's precisely what I mean. Yeah, no doubt. All right. So, having gotten to that stage, then let me just ask, what do you think, and let's start with Abdulrahman. What do you think the next stage is? By the way, we're almost out of time, so I think we are sort of wrapping up our conversation here. What do you think the next stage is after this visit for U.S.-Saudi bilateral relations? What does this visit set up? What does it tee up as the next step forward, even if the steps are modest? What would they be? So let me
Uh,
begin.
I think right now there are so many signed agreement between all levels, really, and I think that will take a long time to process and to go forward. The good thing about the conference visit this time, it's been organized. It has been organized. It's been in the organization process for a long time, actually, for months before. So all the teams are working there. They're looking to how the implementation. Now, the issue, if some of the agreement will require Congress approval or needs government, extended negotiation, maybe this is something will take place, will take some time. That's an American side of this
Yeah,
business.
sure.
Uh, regarding the political situation, I believe that it's clearly defined now. This visit in particular defined the Saudi-American relations is at best right now, probably since the FDR. So I think that this is quite they need to be cemented, need to be proved, need to be where they work together on issues in the region, including the Arab-Israeli struggle, including the stability of the region when it comes to Iraq, Syria, Yemen, these surrounding countries to Saudi Arabia, they do matter to the American security as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair enough. I'm actually tempted to agree with Abdulrahman. I'm not sure it is hyperbolic to say that relations are at their best since FDR. That strikes me as actually plausibly true in the sense that, for example, you just had this unicorn event regarding Syria, where there was an open battle between an Israeli narrative that argued for or tremendous amounts of caution regarding the new Syrian government, and a Saudi narrative that argued for American engagement, embrace, reduction in sanctions, personal engagement with President Sharia and all of that. And the Saudi narrative and policy agenda won out over the Israeli one. I can't remember the last time that happened. I'm not talking about a weapons sale like AWACS or something, but a big policy question for the U.S. that was not a bilateral one, U.S. Israeli or U.S. Saudi, but it had to do with where the U.S. was going to go with its own bilateral with some third party, and that the kind of any Arab narrative won out over an Israeli one. That's quite extraordinary. Anyway,
I
unless,
mean, may I add something?
yeah, you
Uh,
may, of course.
yeah, I mean, look, the Israelis are good soldiers, but they are not really good politicians, or let's say they are not good diplomats. They
They
win
used to be.
wars, but then what after
They,
that?
they used to be good propagandists and diplomats and all that, but yeah, they seem to have lost their touch as they veered to the right. Their ability to explain themselves to the outside world has tanked because there's no covering up some of this stuff. Anyway, Bernie, I'd like to ask you what you think about the condition of the relationship and where it could go from here. Baby steps, big steps. There is still no agreement on the nuclear front, for example. I mean, that's an obvious gaping hole.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is that in the case of both the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Trump, you have people who can actually move very quickly and in very dramatic fashion. So, for
Mm.
instance, one can imagine that if President Trump is willing to put a lot of pressure on the Israelis, and with the elections next year in Israel, you have a different coalition of a government with a different coalition that's willing to
Mm.
give something to the Palestinians, I think normalization will be back on immediately
Yeah.
with the Saudis. So, you know,
That's a big if, though,
yeah, it
because
is a big if.
it's kind of hard to imagine anyone, even a center-left coalition in Israel, getting away with that, and or even wanting to do it. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but you know, one could imagine if
Yeah, it's possible.
Trump really wants the Nobel, so you know he could put all kinds of pressure.
That would be the clearest route. Yes.
Yeah, so one could imagine that. I think the relationship is, you know, at an all-time high. I agree, but as I said in my initial comments, I think it's like with Israel, it's become much more one part, you know, one part with one party rather than bipartisan.
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges for the Saudis, just like it is for the Israelis, is to come back to the center and to have a more bipartisan, um, you know, consensus on the importance of the relationship. And that's a heavy lift, and I think the Saudis need to start working on it.
That's an incredibly important corrective. Thank you. So, Kristin, that means you get the last word here. Where does the relationship stand? Where does it go next?
I'll pick up 2 points. One, the point that you mentioned in passing, when we had the prior meeting, before the meeting between President Trump and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and Hisham al-Ghanem was here. He said he thought the key thing to look at in terms of where the advancement was going, in terms of the security and these close ties, was going to be nuclear, and getting that agreement to move forward. So I think it's kind of striking to bring back to that, and that we haven't discussed it here. And the reason we haven't discussed it here is because it didn't look like there was much progress that was
Yeah.
made on that. Um, so we do have a piece, keep promoting all of our work, but we have great scholars working for us, by Nur al-Eid, who wrote about the nuclear agreement. I mean, yeah, what didn't transpire in the nuclear
Right.
agreement and possible roads forward. So I think that's a really good piece to look at. I'm not going to try to paraphrase it because, yeah, it's really not my area of expertise. But I
It's a
think
complex
there's a
piece.
number of ways that could be moving forward, even if we didn't. And she suggests that, I guess, why we'll summarize it, that if, since we didn't hear anything, there might be just an idea to kind of move ahead and start to progress, without sort of the 1, 2, 3 agreement, and to not touch on the whole idea of, yeah,
Of enrichment.
of enrichment. But look at her piece. But I do think that's going to be very important to watch going forward, because that is a critically important, both for economically for Saudi Arabia, but also for their security posture. And I'll just say one final point. Another thing that didn't come up, which used to come up a lot, or it kind of came up in passing, is the idea of human rights, with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
You know, the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi was brought up by reporters, in the White House. And I think it's kind of a sign of the times that it was President Trump, that kind of really got on the reporter and took issue with her even bringing up the issue of Jamal Khashoggi,
Mhm.
and his murder. I think the Crown Prince actually had a prepared statement. He was willing to like address it. But I think, to Bernie's point, that is something that people haven't forgotten about in the United States. I think the importance of Saudi Arabia has meant that they've moved, you know, and I think after a number of years where they really did suffer from this action, they have started to move on beyond that. But it does still stir around, and colors, especially I would say on the side of the Democrats, how they see, the administration. So I thought it was interesting that one thing did come out of this, which didn't get reported on very much, but there was an American,
Right. The dual citizen Saad al-Mahdi. Yeah.
yeah, who was on a travel ban. And there are a lot of people in Saudi Arabia under travel bans, I should say. But this was an American citizen, who was given permission to leave, I
To
believe.
return to Florida, right?
Return, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, it is interesting to see. I know this is not a time under the Trump administration where human rights obviously is going to have a really big prominent role. But I think, kind of listening to some of those voices, that might be part of the case in building those new ties again with the Democrats and expanding that relation. So I wanted to at least put that
Well,
on.
I mean, for sure, it's significant because, well, Trump, I mean, you know, anytime he can say he helped an American, you know, that sort of flag waving that he likes. But also, his tweets were very mildly critical of the government, and it was sort of a strange overreaction. I don't know. I guess it's up to every country what they want to consider dangerous sedition, but this seemed hard to justify. So was interesting that Trump got progress on human rights, as part of his whole outreach to Saudi Arabia. So that's, even if it's just restricted to a dual U.S. Saudi national coming back to Florida, that's a good thing. So we'll leave the conversation on that positive note. Really a high water mark for U.S.-Saudi relations, even having positive impact on things as distant from the Trumpian foreign policy agenda as a human rights issue. And I really want to thank Kristin, Bernie, and Abdulrahman for joining us today and shedding a great deal of light on the aftermath of this important visit, which I do think sort of a key inflection point. And I'd like to invite you all to join us again next time for another great AGSI webinar. And as Kristin keeps pointing out, we have all these wonderful essays on our website. And so if you want, you can look at the link to the nuclear issue essay quickly on the chat before we stop the conversation, or you can just go to our website, agsi.org, and look at it there. We've got lots of great stuff. Thank you all for joining us, and see you again next time. Bye-bye.